On a Thursday afternoon in early April, families across a province just outside Tehran gathered beneath a bridge to celebrate one of Iran's oldest traditions, a day meant for picnics, laughter, and spending time outdoors with loved ones. Exactly the kind of ordinary, deeply human moment that rarely makes it into the broader narrative of a war defined mostly by missile strikes and military statistics. Within hours, the bridge became a military target, struck by American forces as part of a deliberate, publicly announced policy shift, and the civilians gathered beneath it became casualties of a war that had, up until that point, mostly been fought against military and industrial sites rather than the kind of everyday civilian infrastructure ordinary families actually rely on and gather around in their daily lives. That single strike, and the broader doctrine behind it, represents one of the most legally and morally contested decisions of this entire conflict. And understanding exactly what happened, why it happened, and what the actual consequences have been, requires walking through this story carefully rather than reducing it to a single dramatic headline. It's worth sitting with the weight of that opening moment for a second before diving into the broader policy context, because it's easy for a detail like a national holiday celebration to get lost amid the sweeping political rhetoric and strategic justifications that dominate most coverage of a war this large and this sprawling. Sizdah Be-dar is a genuinely beloved tradition in Iranian culture, one of the few remaining pre-Islamic Persian customs still widely observed across the country, when families set aside a full day specifically to leave their homes, gather outdoors, and mark the close of the New Year holiday season together. That a strike justified on entirely military grounds happened to land at the exact time and place where ordinary families had gathered for exactly that kind of joyful, distinctly non-military occasion is the specific tension this entire story keeps circling back to: the gap between the abstract, strategic language used to justify infrastructure strikes and the very human, very specific reality of who actually ends up standing beneath that infrastructure at any given moment. Let's start with where this specific policy actually came from, because it didn't emerge in a vacuum. By early April, the broader war between the United States, Israel, and Iran had already been grinding on for over a month, and one particular flashpoint had become increasingly central to the entire conflict: Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz and its continued attacks on commercial shipping attempting to transit that waterway. A crisis that had already proven remarkably resistant to more conventional military pressure by that point in the war. President Trump had grown visibly frustrated with the pace of that specific crisis, and on April 5th, he issued a public warning through his social media platform that he would strike Iran's power plants and bridges if the strait remained closed by a deadline he set for 2 days later. The language he used in that warning was genuinely extreme even by the standards of wartime political rhetoric, telling Iran it would be, in his words, living in hell if the waterway wasn't reopened, and at one point suggesting that an entire civilization would die that night, never to be brought back again if his demands weren't met. Language that stood out even against the backdrop of a war that had already produced its own share of harsh escalatory rhetoric from officials on both sides. That kind of language drew immediate, widespread condemnation, and not just from predictable critics, reflecting genuine cross-cutting alarm at how far this specific threat seemed to depart from decades of established norms around the conduct of modern warfare. Lawmakers from both political parties in the United States, former government officials, human rights organizations, and even the Pope publicly criticized the rhetoric, and more than 100 international law experts signed an open letter specifically warning that American strikes on Iran, particularly strikes targeting infrastructure like bridges and power plants, raised serious concerns about violations of international humanitarian law, including the potential for actual war crimes, a warning that proved to be remarkably prescient given everything that followed in the weeks ahead. That's an extraordinarily serious accusation for a group of legal scholars to level publicly and collectively against a sitting American administration, and it reflects just how far outside the normal bounds of accepted military conduct this specific threat appeared to fall to a significant portion of the international legal community. It's worth understanding why a threat like this one, even before any actual strike took place, generated such an unusually broad and unusually swift coalition of criticism. Statements threatening the deliberate destruction of an entire country's power infrastructure and transportation network aren't the kind of rhetoric that typically comes from senior officials in modern Western democracies, precisely because doing so runs so directly counter to decades of carefully developed international humanitarian law, specifically designed in the aftermath of earlier 20th century conflicts to prevent exactly this style of total, infrastructure-focused warfare from becoming normalized again. When that kind of rhetoric does surface, it tends to draw exactly the kind of rapid, cross-ideological condemnation seen here, uniting voices that rarely find themselves in agreement on much else, from religious leaders concerned with humanitarian principle to legal scholars, concerned with the erosion of hard-won international norms to political figures worried about the precedent being set for how future conflicts might be conducted by any nation willing to point to this specific episode as justification. The deadline came and went without the strait fully reopening, and Israeli forces conducted a large-scale wave of strikes across Iran that same week, including a strike on a key railway bridge in Kashan explicitly aimed at disrupting military logistics. Iran, for its part, responded to the mounting pressure in a way that revealed just how seriously its own government was taking the specific threat against power infrastructure. Iranian officials actually called on young people across the country to form human chains around power plants, physically positioning civilian volunteers as a kind of human shield specifically to protect that infrastructure from anticipated American strikes, an appeal that appears to have resonated with at least some segment of the population, given how widely it was reported and discussed in Iranian media at the time, and a request that itself raises its own set of difficult questions about how governments on both sides of this conflict have approached the safety of ordinary civilians caught in the middle of it. There's a genuinely uncomfortable symmetry worth pointing out in that specific Iranian response. Because deliberately positioning civilian volunteers around a potential military target, even with the stated purpose of protecting rather than shielding a genuinely military asset, sits in its own legally ambiguous territory under international humanitarian law. Using civilians, specifically to deter an attack by making that attack more likely to produce civilian casualties, raises exactly the kind of human shield concerns that international law also explicitly prohibits, regardless of whether the underlying motivation is protective rather than tactical in the traditional military sense. That doesn't excuse or justify striking infrastructure where civilians have gathered, but it does illustrate just how quickly this specific conflict pushed both sides toward increasingly fraught, ethically contested decisions. Once the threat of infrastructure strikes entered the picture, with Iran's own response arguably increasing rather than reducing the risk to the very civilians it claimed to be trying to protect. Then, on April 2nd, just days before that publicly announced deadline, American forces struck what's become known as the Karaj B1 bridge, an unfinished bridge structure in Alborz province just outside Tehran. The American justification for that specific strike was framed in explicitly military terms, with officials describing the bridge as a planned supply route that Iran intended to use for moving missiles and drones, making it, in the Pentagon's assessment, a legitimate military target regardless of its unfinished, ostensibly civilian classification at the time of the strike. That strike came on the same day Trump delivered a speech vowing to escalate strikes against Iran over the following 2 to 3 weeks, specifically to, in his words, bring them back to the Stone Ages, language that, once again, generated enormous international backlash, given how explicitly it seemed to embrace targeting a country's basic infrastructure and standard of living rather than narrowly focused military assets alone. Here's where the story becomes genuinely tragic, rather than simply politically controversial. The deputy governor of Alborz province confirmed that the people killed and injured in that specific strike were civilians who had gathered beneath the bridge to celebrate Sizdah Be-dar, a traditional Iranian holiday observed on the 13th day after Nowruz, the Persian New Year, when families traditionally spend the day outdoors, often picnicking near rivers, parks, or, in this case, apparently underneath a bridge that offered shade and open space. That timing appears to have been a devastating coincidence rather than any kind of deliberate targeting of the holiday gathering itself, but the outcome was the same, regardless of intent. Ordinary families engaged in an entirely peaceful, long-standing cultural tradition became casualties of a strike, justified on the grounds of degrading a supply route that, notably, hadn't even been completed yet. It's worth pausing to consider the targeting decision-making that would have preceded a strike like this one, because it raises genuinely difficult questions about how military planners weigh timing and location when selecting a target of this nature. Sizdah Be-dar falls on a fixed, well-known date on the Iranian calendar, widely publicized and observed nationwide, which means any intelligence assessment prepared in advance of a strike on infrastructure located in a populated area near Tehran should, in principle, have accounted for the strong likelihood of exactly this kind of gathering happening in the vicinity on that specific day. Whether that consideration was factored into the targeting decision, weighed and ultimately outweighed by the assessed military value of striking the bridge before it could be completed, or simply overlooked entirely in the broader push to escalate pressure ahead of Trump's own self-imposed deadline, remains one of the more consequential, unanswered questions hanging over this entire episode. One that speaks directly to the proportionality assessment at the heart of international humanitarian law's approach to exactly this kind of dual-use target. Iran's foreign minister responded to the strike in unusually pointed terms, condemning it as an illegal breach of international law and specifically pushing back against the underlying strategic logic behind targeting infrastructure like an unfinished bridge in the first place. He argued that striking civilian structures, even ones with some claim military utility like an unfinished bridge, would not compel Iranians to surrender, and characterized the attack as reflecting what he called the defeat and moral collapse of an adversary he described as being in disarray, essentially arguing that resorting to infrastructure strikes represented American frustration and strategic failure rather than genuine military necessity or strength. Whatever one makes of that specific characterization, which obviously reflects Iran's own interest in framing the strike as evidence of American desperation, the underlying legal argument echoed almost exactly what the international law experts had already warned about days earlier, that striking objects generally considered indispensable to the survival of a civilian population. A category that traditionally includes bridges, power infrastructure, and similar essential services, runs directly into some of the most well-established protections written into the Geneva Conventions. Protections specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of infrastructure-focused warfare from spilling over into genuine harm against ordinary civilian life. It's worth pausing here to actually walk through the legal and ethical tension at the heart of this entire controversy, because it's more nuanced than a simple story of a war crime versus a legitimate military strike, even though plenty of voices on both sides have tried to frame it in exactly those absolute terms. International humanitarian law does generally permit strikes against infrastructure that has genuine, demonstrable military utility, even when that same infrastructure also serves civilian purposes, a category often referred to as dual-use infrastructure. A bridge that's actually being used, or is credibly about to be used, to move military equipment can, under many interpretations of the laws of armed conflict, be considered a legitimate target, provided the anticipated military advantage gained from striking it is proportionate to the expected harm to civilians and civilian objects in the surrounding area. The genuine controversy in this specific case centers on exactly where that line actually sits, whether an unfinished bridge, one that hadn't yet been used for any documented military purpose, and that happened to be occupied by civilians celebrating a national holiday at the precise moment of the strike, actually meets that proportionality and necessity threshold, or whether it represents exactly the kind of infrastructure targeting the Geneva Conventions were specifically written to prevent. There's a specific legal concept worth introducing here, because it's exactly the framework international law experts have repeatedly invoked when discussing this specific style of strike throughout the war. The Geneva Conventions explicitly prohibit attacking, destroying, removing or rendering useless objects indispensable to the survival of a civilian population, a category that traditionally includes foodstuffs, agricultural areas, drinking water installations, and critically, in more modern interpretations, that have developed alongside the increasing centrality of electricity to daily civilian life, power generation infrastructure as well. Bridges occupy a slightly different, somewhat more ambiguous position within that same body of law, since transportation infrastructure has historically been treated with greater flexibility given its more obvious potential for direct military application, moving troops, equipment, and supplies, compared to something like a power plant or a water treatment facility that serves an almost entirely civilian function under ordinary circumstances. That distinction is part of why the American justification for the Karaj strike leaned so heavily on the bridge's alleged intended use as a military supply route specifically, since that framing was necessary to bring the strike within the more permissive legal category applied to transportation infrastructure, a justification that becomes considerably harder to sustain once it's extended, as Trump's July policy explicitly did, to include power plants as an automatic blanket category of retaliatory target, regardless of any individual facility's specific demonstrated military connection. That tension only intensified as this war continued grinding forward through the following months, and it's worth tracing how the policy actually evolved from an isolated, controversial strike into something resembling a formalized, publicly declared doctrine. By mid-July, months after that initial April deadline in strike, the underlying problem that had originally prompted Trump's threat, Iranian attacks on commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, hadn't actually gone away. Central Command reported that over the preceding 3 months alone, Iran had attacked more than 30 separate commercial vessels transiting that waterway, endangering hundreds of mariners and repeatedly undermining freedom of navigation through one of the world's most important shipping corridors. 18 American service members had been killed over the course of this broader conflict by that point, and a ceasefire that had briefly taken hold earlier in the summer had already collapsed amid renewed attacks and mutual accusations of violations from both sides. Against that backdrop of mounting frustration and repeated failures to actually stop the tanker attacks through more conventional military pressure, Trump escalated his earlier threat into something far more explicit and far more procedural. On July 22nd, he posted a formal policy statement declaring that from that point forward, any time Iran shot at a ship in the Strait of Hormuz, whether using a missile, a rocket, a drone, or any other weapon, the United States would respond by bombing and destroying one bridge or power plant, explicitly including targets located next to or inside the capital city of Tehran itself. That's a genuinely remarkable statement to make publicly and explicitly as declared policy, essentially establishing an automatic tit-for-tat exchange rate between an attack on a single commercial vessel and the deliberate destruction of a specific piece of Iranian civilian infrastructure, stripped of any pretense that each individual strike would need to be separately justified based on that specific target's demonstrated military utility. Iran's response to that specific threat revealed its own escalatory logic too, with an Iranian official telling state media that Tehran would respond to any such American attacks by deliberately causing power outages in countries hosting American troops across the region, a threat that, if actually carried out, would represent its own significant escalation against civilian infrastructure and civilian populations in third-party countries that weren't necessarily direct combatants in the underlying conflict between Washington and Tehran. That kind of reciprocal targeting logic, where each side justifies striking the other's civilian-adjacent infrastructure specifically because the other side has done or threatened to do the same, represents one of the more dangerous escalatory patterns that can emerge in a prolonged conflict, since it tends to steadily erode whatever limits and restraint existed at the outset of the war, with each round of justification making the next round easier to defend politically and rhetorically, regardless of how far it strays from the more narrowly targeted military campaign the conflict originally started as. It's worth thinking through just how serious Iran's specific counter-threat actually was, because deliberately targeting power infrastructure in third-party countries hosting American troops would represent a meaningful widening of the conflict's geographic scope, well beyond the direct exchanges between Washington and Tehran that had defined the war up to that point. Countries across the Gulf region host substantial American military presences, specifically because of long-standing security partnerships, and civilian populations in those countries, people with no direct stake in the underlying dispute between the United States and Iran, would bear the immediate consequences of any deliberate attempt to disrupt their electrical grids purely as retaliation for a policy decision made in Washington. That kind of threat illustrates just how quickly an escalatory logic built around infrastructure targeting can spread outward from its original two combatants, drawing in civilian populations in entirely separate countries, simply because those countries happen to host military assets belonging to one side of the underlying conflict. It's worth connecting this specific infrastructure targeting policy to the broader naval blockade that was running in parallel during this exact same period, because the two campaigns clearly reinforced each other as part of a single, overarching pressure strategy. American forces reinstated a naval blockade against Iranian ports around the same time this bridge and power plant policy was being formalized, and Central Command specifically confirmed firing on a Curacao-flagged oil tanker that had ignored repeated warnings while attempting to reach Karg Island, the terminal responsible for funneling out roughly 90% of Iran's total oil exports. Taken together, the naval blockade squeezing Iran's export revenue and the explicit threat to destroy domestic infrastructure every time Iran struck back at shipping represented a comprehensive, multi-pronged economic and infrastructure pressure campaign, one seemingly designed to make the cost of continuing to threaten commercial shipping through the strait as painful and as immediate as possible for the Iranian government, and by extension, for the broader Iranian population that depends on that same infrastructure for basic daily life. That's really the core strategic logic behind this entire approach, and it's worth examining honestly rather than dismissing it purely as reckless escalation, even while taking the legal and humanitarian concerns raised about it just as seriously as they genuinely deserve to be taken. Military and political leaders who advocate for this kind of infrastructure pressure campaign generally argue that a purely military target-focused strategy, one that only strikes missile sites, naval vessels, and command centers, has repeatedly proven insufficient on its own to actually stop Iran's continued attacks on shipping throughout this war, given that 30 separate vessel attacks had already occurred in just the preceding 3 months, despite months of sustained conventional military strikes against exactly those kinds of targets. Under that logic, escalating the cost of continued aggression by threatening infrastructure that ordinary civilians and the government alike depend on represents an attempt to change the underlying calculation in Tehran, making the continued harassment of shipping expensive enough in terms of domestic infrastructure and public discontent that the regime's own political survival calculus shifts toward actually stopping the behavior rather than continuing to absorb losses that, up to that point, had been concentrated almost entirely on military and industrial targets that the government could more easily absorb and message around domestically. The counter-argument, and it's a genuinely serious one, is that this kind of strategy has an extremely poor historical track record of actually achieving its stated goal while carrying enormous humanitarian and legal costs along the way. Historical examples of infrastructure-focused bombing campaigns, stretching back through multiple 20th century conflicts, have generally shown that deliberately targeting a civilian population's access to electricity, transportation, and basic services tends to harden public resolve and government resistance rather than breaking it, particularly in societies where the government can effectively channel public anger toward the foreign power conducting the strikes rather than toward its own policies that provoked the conflict in the first place. Iran's own foreign minister explicitly tried to invoke exactly that dynamic in his response to the Karaj bridge strike, framing continued infrastructure attacks as strengthening Iranian resolve rather than weakening it, a rhetorical move that reflects a genuine and historically well-supported pattern in how populations tend to respond to this specific style of warfare, regardless of whether that particular claim about Iranian public opinion happens to be accurate in this specific case. That historical pattern is worth spelling out a bit further because it's not just a rhetorical talking point Iran's government happened to deploy. It reflects a genuinely well-documented finding across multiple academic studies of strategic bombing campaigns conducted throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Researchers examining the effectiveness of infrastructure-focused air campaigns, from the strategic bombing of European cities during the Second World War through more recent conflicts involving deliberate strikes on power grids and transportation networks, have generally found that this kind of pressure tends to produce measurable short-term disruption and genuine civilian hardship without reliably translating into the kind of political capitulation or policy change the strategy is typically designed to achieve. Populations subjected to this kind of sustained infrastructure pressure frequently redirect their frustration toward the foreign power conducting the strikes rather than toward their own domestic leadership, particularly in more authoritarian or tightly controlled information environments where the government retains significant ability to shape the public narrative around who bears responsibility for the resulting hardship. That historical track record is precisely why so many of the international law experts and former officials who criticized this specific policy weren't only making a legal argument about what's permitted under the Geneva Conventions, but also a practical, strategic argument that this specific approach was unlikely to actually achieve its stated goal even on its own terms, regardless of the serious legal and humanitarian costs involved in attempting it. There's also a genuinely important distinction worth drawing between the legal framework governing this kind of strike and the practical, political reality of how it actually gets carried out and perceived. Even under the most permissive reading of dual-use infrastructure targeting doctrine, the legal justification for striking something like a bridge or a power plant depends heavily on that specific piece of infrastructure, having a demonstrable, current, or clearly imminent military application, not simply the theoretical possibility that it could someday be used that way. Announcing, as Trump did in July, an automatic policy of striking one bridge or power plant every single time Iran attacks a ship, regardless of whether that specific piece of infrastructure has any documented military connection at all, moves considerably further away from that traditional legal framework and closer to what international law experts have specifically warned constitutes collective punishment against a civilian population for actions taken by that population's government and military forces, a category of conduct that's explicitly and unambiguously prohibited under the Geneva Conventions, regardless of how frustrated or provoked the party issuing such threats might genuinely be. So what actually happened? Pulling all of these threads together into the honest, complete picture the title of this whole discussion promises. An American administration, facing a genuinely difficult and prolonged crisis involving repeated attacks on international shipping that more conventional military strikes hadn't managed to fully resolve, escalated its rhetoric and eventually its actual policy toward explicitly targeting Iranian infrastructure, including bridges and power plants, as a deterrent and punishment mechanism tied directly to Iran's continued attacks on vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. That policy produced at least one strike, the attack on the unfinished Karaj bridge, that killed and injured civilians who happened to be celebrating a national holiday at the exact location and moment American forces determined the structure represented a legitimate military target. That specific strike and the broader policy framework surrounding it drew serious, sustained condemnation from international legal scholars, human rights organizations, and even religious leaders, all warning that this approach risks crossing directly into war crimes territory under well-established international humanitarian law. And despite all of that controversy, the underlying strategic problem this entire policy was originally designed to solve, Iran's continued willingness to attack commercial shipping in the Strait persisted for months afterward, with more than 30 separate vessel attacks occurring in the 3 months leading up to Trump's more formalized July policy announcement, raising genuine, serious questions about whether this specific approach has actually achieved its stated strategic objective, or whether it's primarily just added a deeply controversial, legally fraught new dimension to an already devastating conflict, without meaningfully changing Iran's underlying behavior. That's really the most honest, complete answer to what actually happened here. This wasn't a single, clean military operation with an unambiguous outcome. It was a genuinely contested escalation, one that reflects the real tension every military and political leadership faces when more conventional approaches fail to achieve a desired outcome quickly enough, the temptation to escalate toward targets that promise faster, more visible pressure, but that carry dramatically higher legal, moral, and humanitarian risk. Whether that specific gamble ultimately proves strategically worthwhile for the United States in terms of actually changing Iran's calculus around attacking commercial shipping remains genuinely unresolved based on everything that's happened so far. While the human cost of at least the initial strike on that unfinished bridge, ordinary families killed and injured while celebrating an entirely peaceful cultural tradition, is a cost that's already been paid regardless of how the broader strategic question eventually gets answered. There's a final point worth making that ties this entire episode back to a much older and much broader debate about the ethics and effectiveness of modern warfare, one that long predates this specific conflict with Iran, and that will almost certainly continue shaping how future conflicts get fought and justified long after this particular war eventually reaches some kind of conclusion. Every generation of military planners eventually confronts the same basic temptation once a more conventional campaign fails to produce results quickly enough: the pull toward broader, more visible, more immediately painful forms of pressure that promise faster results, but that carry dramatically higher costs in terms of civilian harm and legal exposure. How a government responds to that temptation, whether it holds the line at narrowly justified, genuinely dual-use targets or expands toward the kind of blanket, automatic infrastructure targeting policy eventually adopted here, says as much about that government's own institutional restraint and respect for international law as it does about the actual military situation it's responding to. This specific episode, from the April strike on an unfinished bridge during a national holiday celebration, to the formalized July policy explicitly naming power plants near the Iranian capital as legitimate retaliatory targets, will likely be studied and debated for years as a genuine test case of exactly where that line gets drawn in practice. Once the pressure to show results collides directly with the legal and moral constraints modern international law was specifically built to enforce. What do you think about all this? Do you think targeting infrastructure like bridges and power plants represents a legitimate, if difficult, military strategy, given how consistently more conventional strikes had failed to stop Iran's attacks on shipping throughout this war? Or do you think this specific policy crosses a clear, well-established legal line, regardless of how frustrating and prolonged the underlying military situation had become by that point in the conflict? Do you think the tragic outcome at the Karaj Bridge reflects a genuine, if devastating, targeting error involving legitimate dual-use infrastructure? Or does it illustrate exactly the kind of predictable harm that critics warned this entire approach would inevitably produce once implemented at scale, especially given how widely known and how fixed on the calendar the Sizdah Be-dar holiday actually is? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this is exactly the kind of complex, morally serious question where thoughtful, informed perspectives genuinely matter. And I'd like to hear how you're weighing the military necessity arguments against the humanitarian and legal concerns raised by so many credible voices throughout this specific controversy. If this breakdown helped you understand the full context behind headlines that often get reduced to a single dramatic claim in either direction, share it with someone who's been trying to follow this specific and genuinely difficult thread of the broader war. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next update, and stay tuned, because with this policy still formally in effect and the underlying shipping crisis still unresolved, this almost certainly isn't the last infrastructure strike this conflict will produce, and the next one could raise exactly the same difficult questions all over again.